Well, sometimes we mess up, and this time we messed up really bad. Fellas, I've been wrong, completely wrong when talking about pulse rifles and essentially the range of pulse rifles. I've misinterpreted the patch notes. Now, luckily, nothing's really changed all that much for me in terms of the god roll for the BXR and for Horus Lease. Granted though, considering what we discovered, we will probably be making an adjustment at least to the BXR. First up, the patch note. Let me show you where I got confused. It stated that pulse rifles had increased damage fall off near distance based on the range stats. And at 0 range, that was increased from 15 to 16 meters, and at 100 range, increased from 22.5 to 24 meters. Note that this is the hipfire fall off distance and is multiplying by zoom value to get the aim down sight's fall off distance. But here at the bottom, this is the one piece that I thought I understood, but I got it all wrong. Damage fall off far distance remains 40 meters regardless of the range stats. In my brain, when we first read this in the TWAB weeks ago, I thought this meant that regardless of the range stat, all pulse rifles would have a cap of 40 meters, or at least that was how I interpreted it. However, damage fall off is not the same as damage fall off far distance. These terms like damage fall off near distance and damage fall off far distance is actually the parameters of when your damage fall off begins and when it ends. Big shout out to Mercules, who actually gave me some clarification on this. By the way, this is our man that has all the Excel spreadsheets, but he says that damage fall off far distance is the distance at which their damage fall off bottoms out when hip firing, aka they hit the lower limit of how much damage they can deal, and damage fall off near distance is the distance at which damage fall off begins, again though, when hip firing. Needless to say, guys, I've led you all astray, and I needed to make this video to correct this problem. Now overall, this is an increase in range for hip fire weapons, most notably the BXR. Bungie essentially increased the effective distance of hip fire though for all pulse rifles based on your range stat. However, you will start to experience damage fall off at about 16 meters at 0 range and 24 meters at 100 range. But the amount of damage fall off that you receive will be capped at 40 meters. Now, let me be real. You do not want to be hip firing a pulse rifle at 40 meters. By no means is standing in a lane hip firing with your pulse rifles at 40 plus meters an optimal strategy. It's just not. Unless, of course, Bungie gets kind of funny and gives us a Tex Mechanica pulse rifle in the future, which is somehow weirdly tied to this sandbox change. Now, of course, we wanted to dive in this and test it ourselves. And upon further testing, we did discover that this only applies to your range while firing from the hip. Again, far distance fall off referring to the damaged floor of hip fire. Now, each weapon has an effective hip fire range until it hits that damage fall off range. And once you hit damage fall off, your damage decreases over distance until you hit the damaged floor, otherwise known as far distance fall off. And for all pulse rifles, that's now 40 meters. Now, as far as the patch notes go, this is really an insignificant change outside of maybe the BXR, which is really tuned for that hip fire shot. But again, even at 20 meters, guys, 15 meters for that matter, I'm aiming down sights with the BXR. 9 times out of 10, you need to be scoped in when engaging opponents. But what this does mean is pulse rifles that can have super deadly range is no longer capped like I led you to believe. Which takes us to our God Roll BXR video. Now, we talked about the BXR. We gave it a glowing review in this sandbox, and yes, it is very, very good. Lightweight pulse rifles in general feel really, really good. But I said in that video how you didn't have to go with high range, that it doesn't really matter considering 40 meters is the cap. I lied to you. I'm so sorry. No, if you actually want to go the route of high range, hammer-forged rifling, accuracies rounds, rangefinder, or range masterwork, fellas, you're looking at about 47 meters or 47.36 there with the BXR. I would definitely do that. And again, perpetual motion rangefinder, still a fantastic combo. Granted, I still like perpetual motion kill clip. And if you were to go that route, that's still a fantastic roll. Just have high range. Again, in that video, I led you wrong, which is why we're going to be taking down that review for BXR. I'm glad we got out in front of this now though, before we made any more pulse rifle reviews. Now, the other pulse rifle we did talk about here recently is of course Horus Lease. Now, Horus Lease doesn't change that much because you can't even reach 40 meters with Horus Lease. And what the roll that we recommended, that's pretty much still the same. Hammer forged or small bore, accuracies rounds, perpetual motion, kill clip, extremely deadly, but at best with hammer forged rifling, expect to go no further than 34.5 meters, maybe 35 with full bore. Now, despite me getting this completely wrong on you guys, look, pulse rifles feel really good this sandbox. Both the BXR and Horus Lease, despite them being in 2 different archetypes, feel fantastic here. And considering we don't have a 40 meter cap on these pulse rifles, even better. Now, the question is going to come up, if that's the case, what's the furthest reaching pulse rifles in the game? And then, of course, the other question, does that even matter? Because to be quite frank, at certain points, having a lot of range on your pulse rifle, you start to get that deviation in those bursts, right? And then on top of that, we don't have all that many maps weapons that could take advantage of that high range. Granted, we have more this season than ever before, considering the new map. But if we were to go across the list right now and take a look at like the furthest reaching pulse rifles, you've got Legal Action, which is a high impact. I know every one of you done forgot about this weapon, but it actually can reach up to pretty crazy ranges. Like a max range roll can reach up to 50 meters. For adaptives, turns out Last Perdition. Yeah, this forgotten Suros pulse rifle, which honestly we needed to be reissued so we can get origin traits for it. But despite that, considering that this weapon also comes with scopes, high range, range finder, this bad baby can reach all the way up to 53 meters. Granted, that's not everything. Again, you do reach a certain point where the shots are just hard to land at those crazy ranges. And then on top of that, crazy zoom is also not always the winner, especially in mid ranges when someone's sitting there strafing back and forth on you. For lightweights, even though the BXR is not a lightweight pulse rifle, it still has one of the best range stats in the game, especially when you start combining things like rangefinder. Now, I know someone's going to bring up, Cross, what about Ogma? It's got pretty good range. And it also has the Omlon Fluid Dynamic traits. Yes, we actually reviewed this last season, but despite Ogma having fairly good stats, with 19 zoom, you're not even going to break 40 meters. Whereas the BXR can break 40 meters, and it also has the ability to back up and tap fire anyone that pushes you. Now, amongst rapid fires, hands down, Peace of Mind is still the king when it comes to range. And we talked about that in our review. I love Horsley's. I actually think it's a better weapon than Peace of Mind. Granted, Peace of Mind is easier to get, or at least the God roll is easy for you to craft. But considering that the weapon comes with such high zoom to begin with a high range roll, you can reach up to 38 meters. And this does outclass other rapid fire pulse rifles, at least those with barrel perks. And that's where Time Worn Spire comes in. And this is where this pulse rifle is still king in its own right. And that's simply because it can roll with scopes. This weapon with high range, with the likes of like Iron Reach, a range masterwork, ricochet rounds, rifle scope ST, you're looking at a range stat of 73, bringing you up to 48.32 meters. Granted, that stability in handling is awful though. Again, even though all of this looks extremely juicy, having max range, considering the maps that we have in rotation, isn't always the clear winner, especially this season, right? Since stability is actually tied in our ability to combat flinch. So guys, that is our correction video on pulse rifles. For those wondering, what about our exotics? Bad Juju, Outbreak, Perfected, No Time to Explain, Collective Obligation, Graviton Lance, Vigilance Wing? What about those? They're good, but again, if you're looking for reach, those weapons have limitations, most notably because their zoom all sit around 17. I know some of these have healthy range stats, but they are limited. Granted, that does take me to what I want to bring up about range. Even though 40 meters is no longer the cap, or at least that's what I led many of you to believe, but when choosing that God roll, I would like for you to stay close to that 40 meter mark, simply because stability is so important. And on top of that, zoom, especially those heavy zoom scopes on some of these pulse rifles, yes, it'll give you all the reach in the world, but at a massive cost. On top of that, anyone within close range of you, you'll just lose track of having that much zoom. So personally, for those rolls, stay around that 40 meter to maybe 45 meter mark. Anything beyond 45 meters with the pulse rifle, just stop. Not saying you can't work with it, but to me, you're losing out in other areas. So guys, that is our correction video. Again, apologies for the BXR video. Big shout out to many of you on YouTube for pointing this out for us. Your corrections helps us so much, so I appreciate it. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.